Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta, and this is the Authors Amplified series, our book talks showcasing Georgia voices on international affairs and global business. Again, I'm Trevor with Global Atlanta, the managing editor. If you don't know about us, we're a news website covering international business, education, culture, trade, all kinds of issues here in Atlanta, with a particular focus on how our city connects with the rest of the world. For those of you who have attended previous Authors Amplified events, we thank you so much for returning. This is our third event in the series. It's kind of a new thing for us. So we hope this will be at least a year-long series and perhaps indefinite. We hope to start some in-person limited attendance events in the coming months and continue to offer the broadcast option for those who can't make it or are not in Atlanta in certain cases. So stay tuned for more updates on the series. And if you missed the previous events with our other two authors, please go back and check those out. Those are really great. And I'm sure today's will be no different. But first of all, before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsor, the Atlanta Global Studies Center, a collaborative Title VI funded center, nationally funded center between Georgia Tech and Georgia State University, which is focused on driving international education to empower the Metro Atlanta region's global agenda. I really love that last tagline there. And I'm going to ask Leah, if you don't mind dropping in the link to the Atlanta Global Studies Center site. Their team could not make the event today. They've got another similarly scheduled event, so I want to make sure we are promoting them. And I'd also like to welcome some of our diplomatic corps here in Atlanta and beyond. I know that we had confirmations from Takashi Shinosuka, who is the Japanese ambassador to Morocco. I don't know if he's made it on, but he was the former Japanese consul general. Hey, Ambassador, how are you? Good to see you. He is the former consul general in Atlanta and left his post to go to Morocco. So we've got some representation from across the water there. We've also got Filiberto Calasibeta, who is the honorary consul of Italy in Georgia. Filiberto, thanks for coming. Theodoros Dimopoulos, the consul of Greece here in the Southeast, based in Atlanta. And then I think I haven't seen her pop up, but I saw her register, Cynthia Blandford, honorary consul of Liberia here in Atlanta. And then on the registration was also Vince Farley, who's the honorary consul of Mali here in Georgia. So thank y'all so much for being here. We're so glad to have such a robust representation from the diplomatic corps. And our guest today is someone who I've been following for quite a long time, but since she was here as a professor at Emory University and doing some research here, and I'm now sadly only getting to know her from afar. We have Dr. Isabella Alexander-Nathani. She's an author, anthropologist, filmmaker, human rights activist. And while she left Atlanta recently to move to California, where she runs Small World Films, a production company, she spent a good bit of time here in Atlanta and has some local links that we'll talk about. The book that we're going to be discussing is her recently released book, Burning at Europe's Borders, and Ethnography on the African Migrant Experience in Morocco. Isabella, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Well, we should note that, first of all, that we're not just talking about a book here. You've also got an upcoming documentary that we'll get a sneak peek of later in the session. Will you tell us a bit about the documentary and how it ties in with the book?
Yeah, I generally like to approach my research projects from various angles in order to make the work accessible to the largest possible audience. And one thing in particular that I try to do is to incorporate documentary filmmaking into my writing process. I find that it allows us to communicate across linguistic and cultural barriers, but perhaps most importantly, to really get at the human element of the issue at hand. And so this particular text and research project that I've been working on over the past decade now centers on migrant and refugee issues in Africa, and specifically those that are unfolding in North Africa towards Europe's southernmost borders, in Libya and Algeria and Morocco. And so the documentary film allowed me to travel with 3 individual family groups who started in the DRC, Mali, and Sierra Leone, and allow audiences to really see what that journey's like over the course of 5 years for families who are fleeing various drivers from poverty to ongoing conflict.
And just a note on approach, I'm just interested as a journalist myself, but like, did you know you were doing the documentary when you first started your research, or did you kind of back into that later on?
I did. I always approach my research projects with the goal of both filming and writing, and so
Hmm.
I knew that was going to be part of it.
Interesting. And so you got some Southern connections here. I know you were born in the region, but again, our link here with the Georgia link here is your time at Emory, I think, for the most part. So how much of the research that formed the basis for the book was done while you were here? And then I also know you've got, maybe through Emory or beyond, you've got some endorsements from some high-powered people, including President Carter, for your work.
Mhm.
So that's another Georgia connection. But what role did your time at Emory and your relationship with the former president play in the production of this?
Yeah, I was completing my doctoral studies at Emory right when I began the filming for this project, and I continued to work there as a professor over the course of writing and publishing this book. So that was really my home base in Atlanta, and was lucky to have an amazing community of colleagues and students, graduate students and undergraduates who participated in various ways in this work as it unfolded. Was very fortunate, as you mentioned, to have former President Jimmy Carter become a fan of this work, and
Hmm.
eventually joined the board of directors for Small World Films, which is
Oh, great.
the small nonprofit social impact filmmaking studio that I run. He actually just, he's an avid reader, and he
Hmm.
happened to read an article that I had published through NPR several years back about this work that I was doing right when I was just getting started on the project, and was interested in it and wanted to learn more. And his assistant sent me an email saying something like, I believe the title line was "Lunch with Jimmy?" question mark, asking if I was able to come in and have a conversation with him and elaborate on the work that I was doing on the ground. And so our relationship kind of developed from there.
Ever modest,
Right.
son of peanut farmer Jimmy Carter. Yeah, for sure.
Amazing.
Well, yes. Well, tell us about. I was intrigued by the title, and really I'm not going to try to pronounce the Arabic word that you get the title from. I'll let you do that. But tell us why it was titled this way, and what this term "burning" really means in the context of the migration journey that many of these Africans are facing.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great place to start. It's both the title of the film that I'm working on as well as this book. In Moroccan Arabic, the word harig is used to describe illegal or undocumented immigration, but it translates directly to the verb to burn. And it comes from two places. One, it comes from the literal burning of identification papers. So the idea that these migrants, asylum seekers, and hopeful refugees, we can get into those distinctions later, are
Hmm.
burning whatever identification papers they might have before they leave home. And they're doing this in hopes of not being repatriated to their starting point if they get detained or stopped at some point along these, very long and grueling journeys that they're taking toward Europe's southern borders. But there's something deeper there to me, which I was really interested in, which is this decision to burn your former identity, your past ties to your family, to your home, to your community, in the attempt of reaching this uncertain future. So
Hmm.
it's this gamble of, your past life is on the line and you don't know for certain that you'll reach a future life on the other side. It originally was being used as a racial slur in these
Hmm.
communities in North Africa. You could hear people being called haraga or burners in a derogatory way. But I noticed over the course of my work how this community of displaced persons had started to appropriate the term with a lot of pride.
Hmm.
That they would say, yes, I'm a burner or a haraga. I was willing to sacrifice myself so that my family might someday know a better world. And
Wow.
that turn, that recognition of their sacrifice was something that was really fascinating to me. So I've tried to weave this thread of, this liminal space that they're
Hmm.
existing in between these past and future lives throughout the work.
Yeah, I really thought that came through. I mean, and particularly it gets heavy on the anthropology at certain points, and which is totally understandable, given that you're trained as a PhD in this discipline. But what I found very interesting was the identity aspect of it, and particularly how you mentioned in the study of anthropology, you wanted to go from this general study of migration to the migrants themselves, like basically bring it down. And not to say you don't have a lot of context in here about the broader macro environment, because you certainly do, and you cover those bases really well. But the focus heavily on the stories of the migrants themselves, I think, was really something that seemed like you were trying to get across. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's something that's often lacking, even if we take a few steps back and we look more broadly at the way that we report and write about and
Mm-hmm.
speak about and make films about issues related to migrants and refugees. We're so often bombarded with the numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
1 in every 100 people in the world is displaced right now. That's the largest crisis of migrants and refugees that we've ever known. It's an overwhelming number. Or we might hear, this many people attempted to cross this fence today, or this many people drowned in the
Mm-hmm.
Mediterranean Sea. And I'm shocked by how rarely we see a name, how rarely we see an image
Mm-hmm.
or hear a story. Who is this person? Why did they leave? What were they fleeing? And what were they hoping to find on the other side? And so I think that turn from migration to the study of migrants or of individuals is really important in humanizing the issue. It's one
Yeah.
that has become so hotly politicized when
Mm-hmm.
at its root, it's about people. It's
Mm-hmm.
really not a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue. And so I think it's important that we continue to insert the humanity into it through the individual, through the names, through the faces, through the stories of their families.
Well, and part of that you talk a lot about, and you can elaborate on this from an anthropological perspective if you would like to, but you talk about push versus pull, and I mean this is obviously something that is talked about when we're talking about immigration or migration, uh, but you really focus heavily on the factors, like, and the fact that they're not all the same for each person, right? That each person has their own motivations, has their own struggle, their own region that they came from, their own language, right? So there's a lot of emphasis placed on, uh, and again, individualizing those stories, and it sounds like that was intentional as well.
Yeah, I think there tends to be a focus on what it is that might be pulling people towards particular places, right? Whether that be access to work opportunities, to
Mm-hmm.
educational opportunities. When in my experience on the ground, and I've spent the past decade living back and forth between West Africa and the US, where have been really deeply embedded in communities that have been heavily impacted by migration. In my experience, those pull factors are so much less significant than the push factors, than people's decision to flee, often with no idea of where the journey will end or where they're intending, the
Mm-hmm.
journey to end in the future. And also, as you highlighted, the complication of those push factors. So it's very rarely one discrete thing. It's often
Mm-hmm.
that there's increasing conflict, violent conflict in the community, coupled with crippling poverty, coupled with an inability to access healthcare for a child who might need it. It's often layers and layers of things that eventually will push people towards the decision to leave home. And I
Mm-hmm.
think remembering that for those who take that migration route across the Mediterranean Sea, which is our most trafficked border region in the world today, and also the deadliest, there's an awareness of what those stakes are. And people don't make that decision lightly,
Mm-hmm.
especially not with family members, with loved ones, often with children in tow.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that they kind of know what they're getting into, but at the same time, there's sort of this mythology around what life awaits them, and you really get at that in the book too. That they didn't. A lot of them, especially Alphonse, you mentioned in the last chapter of the book. I mean, they don't know what is awaiting them, particularly. Like they don't know how hard it's actually going to be to create a new life for themselves, and because not only do they face the challenges getting appropriately documented, but then once they do, they find themselves facing discrimination in certain cases. So is there a mythology that needs to change around what's driving these people, around what's awaiting them when they get to Europe, in the very, very rare cases that they do?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. There's very little awareness of what the migration route actually encompasses. And like you said, of what might or might not be waiting you if you're one of the very, very fortunate few who makes it successfully to a safer country. Um, I think there are a lot of reasons for this, but one of these is the narratives that are passed back home, and for various reasons that we can imagine. The stories that tend to travel back home are the stories of success. The stories that don't tend to make it back are the stories of all that was endured on the way there, or all that might be endured in one's final arrival place. So in the film, one of the characters that I follow is a man named Fino, who eventually makes it to France after 17 years in a liminal space, awaiting this final crossing. And he's homeless, and he's unable to access education, healthcare, work. And that's a hard story to send back home. The majority of those who leave are also young men, very young men. We're talking between the ages of 12 and 22, so many of them minors. And as I'm sure our participants can imagine, there are reasons why that particular group has a lot of shame and guilt around sharing with their community stories of abuse, stories of theft, stories of rape, all of which are very common on the migratory route. Especially sharing those stories with a community and a family network that supported your journey, financially, that you feel indebted to. And so, yes, I think there's a real need to open up lines of communication between sending communities and those who have traveled the route. It's one of the things I'm most excited about doing with the film, is traveling back to communities in West and Central Africa, where these individuals started their journeys, and having them be the experts on the ground to talk to people about what it's really like and what the risks are that you're taking.
Yeah, I found that last chapter in particular very interesting, where you talk about the calculus that they have to make between trying to go through the formal asylum route and trying to start as an undocumented person, and really, like, you're talking about short-term benefit versus long-term gain. I mean, you're not able to, if you're not documented, you're not able to access work opportunities, and you have to look over your shoulder all the time. But if you go for it and then you end up being repatriated, and you're very apt at describing how repatriation doesn't always happen in the way it's supposed to. You end up starting back where you came from, in certain ways, in Morocco, not back where you came from in your home country, which has created this whole issue of being in between, like you mentioned. I want to get into that too, but you mentioned in the book, I noticed that you continually put the European, the migration crisis in quotation marks, and I wanted to know why you did that, and I think I have an idea, but I wanted to hear you describe that. And is this something that's meant to influence public opinion? Creating a crisis out of something that may not be as dire as it seems.
Yeah, I think it's important to take a step back and think about when these terms emerged and how they're being used, and the way in which creating a sense of crisis or a sense of fear in receiving communities can be beneficial to instating new and often stricter and more violent border control policies. So if we look at the numbers, migration, if we're speaking about both the US and the EU, numbers have actually been falling significantly since the height of the Syrian war, which was really a primary driver for asylum seekers into Europe. But yet the continuation of this word crisis, that we've been in crisis for a decade now, I think can be used both to like I said, create fear, uncertainty in receiving communities, and also to justify shifts that are radical in our
Yeah.
immigration laws and border control.
But you also mentioned that the asylum process is crowded and overrun and delayed quite a bit, right? So, like, isn't there a disconnect there? Like, if there were not a crisis, wouldn't it be easier for people to apply? Or is it just that receiving communities are not investing enough in the infrastructure to process those claims?
I think it has more to do with really how outdated and ill-equipped the system is as a whole to deal with numbers. So as just a little bit of background for people, our modern immigration and asylum laws are fairly new. They came into place after World War II to deal specifically with the crisis of individuals who had been displaced from their homes during World War II and no longer felt safe returning to those communities. When they were created, they were never intended to serve a global population. They were intended for this specific issue, and they were never intended to endure for as long as they have. So it's really time that we as a global community adjust these laws to deal with what they're now dealing with, which is, a issue of migration that exists around the world and in very different terms today than it did, 60, 70 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know, we actually had an event on Central American migration yesterday, so this is all fresh in our minds. But I know that, sort of in the U.S., there's certain definitions, right? And you talk about Article 14 in the UN, Convention on Human Rights, and what qualifies you for asylum? For those of us who are not well versed in this, and I'm getting to a question, which is, I saw in the book that you had these people, again, making this calculation: how severe do I make my story sound? Because, whereas, and we're getting into another topic that I want to talk about too, but whereas, from Syria, it's pretty easy to show like there's a civil war going on, right? Other places, people from other places that are either less well understood or where the conflicts are long simmering and not as acute in the moment, they have a harder time proving the hardship. So what are the qualifications, and is there law being broken in the sense that they're not given the opportunity to even share their asylum claims in certain cases?
Yeah, there's a lot.
There's a lot there. I'm sorry about that.
In the most basic sense, among the basic human rights that we are all guaranteed as citizens of the world, one of them is the right to seek asylum if we no longer feel safe in our home country. And there's a lot of debate around what it means to not feel safe in your home country. Mm-hmm. So typically, these claims have been lodged for people who are, experiencing ongoing war, experiencing conflict, political and economic instability, or persecution, because of perhaps their particular race or religion or even gender. Mm-hmm. So these are all typical claims that we see. What this means is that anyone has the right to leave their home country and to seek asylum in a bordering country or a place that they deem is safe. It does not mean that they're guaranteed asylum. It means that, as you said, they're guaranteed the right to at least have their case heard, right? Mm-hmm. To make a plea for why they deserve to be able to stay, or why it's dangerous for them to be returned from the place that they were fleeing. However, there are quotas. Each individual country sets a quota for the number of refugees that they will resettle in a given year. These quotas often, vary depending on who happens to be in political power and their political persuasion. But what it means is that on any given day, there's only a certain number of spots that can be assigned. And so, one of the most interesting interview assignments I ever had was sitting in on the process of, asylum applications with the UNHCR. And getting to spend a couple of weeks really observing what that was like. The average interview lasts about 5 minutes. And you have this really short period of time to not only prove why you are deserving of asylum, but why your case is more deserving than the 100 other cases that might be heard that day. And so for that reason, all the factors that you mentioned become really important. Are you fleeing a region that I, as the UNHCR caseworker, am already familiar with? Do I associate your region with conflict, or is it one like the DRC that we never hear about in the news, right? Also, factors like your gender, your age, and your race become really critical in terms of assigning vulnerability or not to the individual applicant.
Yeah, and I want to get into that racial aspect in just a moment. But you talk about this concept of border externalization, and I think that term is really interesting. You mentioned that there are quotas in every part of the world, and that there are, like we saw over the last 4 years, there are people that gin up controversy around immigrants and refugees in order to serve political ends, right? And so I wanted to ask you, about this process of externalization that you outline in the book. Like, it sounds to me like you're saying this is an intentional strategy on the part of wealthier countries in general to basically outsource the problem elsewhere, or to push it beyond their physical borders to another location, which may be a developing country itself and not quite equipped to handle the inflows in a way that is in line with the values that the destination countries say that they're espousing. So do I have that right? And tell me about that process.
I'm gonna record that and replay it later talks. Yeah, it's I think one of the most significant trends that we've seen emerge in immigration studies over the past couple of years. Australia was sort of the mastermind behind the policy originally, when they started offshoring all of their immigration and asylum
Hmm.
facilities, and interview processes to two small islands off the coast of Australia called Nauru and Manus. Those exact same policies were used and put in place by the EU. And we see an offshoring or a pushing back, an externalization of border controls to North African countries, Libya, Algeria, Morocco. And as you mentioned, these are often countries that are, lower to middle income. And so the exchange is quite simply, we invest money into your economy, we invest money into your, military, police forces, border control, prison systems, in exchange for you handling this issue
Hmm.
for us, often in a way that doesn't meet contemporary human rights standards. And the U.S. is doing the same thing right now with Mexico. So I'm sure
Hmm.
everyone who's here with us today has read stories about how increasingly asylum seekers are being asked to remain in Mexico for the duration of their cases, whereas typically they would have been here in the U.S. for
Hmm.
that waiting period
Hmm.
before their case was either granted asylum or not, and they were returned to their home countries.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I mean, what is the answer from from a European perspective? I mean, should it be, um, I guess it is their obligation under international law, and you really get at this issue in Morocco when you talk about these two Spanish enclaves, where you spend a lot of time in the forest camps with migrants that are trying to scale these fences and get onto European soil, which is these Spanish territories, but are not obviously not welcome, right? So, well, what's the answer there? Is it just to be more hospitable and to adhere to your obligations? I mean, there's probably certain fundamentals that are driving this offshoring of the problem in the first place.
Yeah, so for people who aren't aware, there are these two tiny enclaves in northern Morocco called Ceuta and Melilla. They're about 4 and 7 square miles each, and as Trevor mentioned, they're Spanish territory, and so it makes it the only place on the entire African continent where you can have a land crossing into Europe. So you can set foot on European soil and claim asylum there without making this treacherous Mediterranean crossing, and it's made this a real hotspot for both immigration control and also for those attempting to reach Europe. Um, in these spaces, foreign media is often tightly controlled or banned altogether, which means that there's really not a lot of awareness of what's happening inside these Spanish enclaves in Morocco, both at the border walls and also at the detention centers
Hmm.
that exist there in the enclaves. And I would argue that this is intentional, that places are selected where there's not going to be a lot of interference by journalists or foreign humanitarian aid actors and organizations. And at the very least, we need some transparency. If the EU is funding border controls and detention centers off their own territory or in their territory, in this case in
Hmm.
Morocco, then we need to know what's happening in those
Hmm.
spaces, and that the same human rights standards should be upheld. So nothing should be allowed to transpire in a Spanish-funded detention center in Melilla for unaccompanied minors that wouldn't happen, just a few miles north in Spain. And of course, I would say the same for the U.S. and Mexico, or for Australia and its barrier islands,
Yeah.
that there needs to be a basic standard of human rights.
Well, I think it's interesting because you heard from especially the Trump administration, like we want to show people that they're not necessarily, it's not necessarily the promised land, right? Like you're not necessarily going to be approved and you're making this thousands of mile journey. And so to give people false hope, would is not as humane as people make it out to be. So that's kind of the devil's advocate argument. Like, is there a message that it's sending to say, you know, what's awaiting you on the other side is not necessarily what you made it out to be, like we alluded to earlier. I mean, how much of this is being used to say, like, we are welcoming to a point, but we can't just let everybody in, basically.
Right. I mean, I think that nations that are signatory to the Geneva Convention and
Hmm.
have pledged to uphold human rights have an obligation, legal and moral to do so. And so until those policies change, if we are
Mm,
saying that everyone who feels unsafe has at least the basic right to plead asylum, then that needs to be granted,
mm,
and to be granted equally. Um, but it's not to say that the answer is, to open borders and to let
right.
everyone flow across them. A whole nother point of this conversation that we could take um, another route would be to think about the amount of money that's being vested in border
Mm,
control, mostly really ineffectively. We've shown time and time again that walls do not stop people from
mhm,
crossing. And that amount of money reinvested instead in communities where economic inequality and poverty are primary drivers has proven to be really effective.
mm,
The majority of people don't want to leave home. They don't want
yeah.
to leave their families. They don't want to pick up at 30 years old and move to a country where they don't know the language and they have, not 2 cents in their pocket and they're starting from scratch. Most people, if given the opportunity to safely remain in their home country and build a life there, would take that option.
Mhm,
So I think remembering that those, who are making the journeys are the ones who feel like they have no
right.
other option forward.
Yeah, and I also wanted to go back to the burning aspect of this too, because what particular challenges does it present for the enforcement agencies that these people have no documents, right? Like, because you can't, I mean, if you're trying to repatriate someone and they just say I'm from X country, you really have no way to determine that other than their linguistic background and some maybe some other soft interview kind of factors, but you don't have that hard documentation to show that. I mean, is that a problem? I mean, is that?
It is. In reality, in the spaces that I work, a very, very small percentage of people are properly repatriated or
Mhm,
repatriated according to our law to their home country or to the community where their journey started.
mm,
As you kind of hinted at earlier, most of them end up trapped in this cycle because the place of repatriation is a country in North Africa.
mhm,
And they don't have the means to move beyond that. So it becomes this kind of endless loop of trying to get out and getting sent back to not your home country, but you know your former
right.
place of departure. But this lack of documentation raises all kinds of other issues. One of them being determining minor status.
Mm,
I've traveled with several groups of minors, and they end up kind of arbitrarily scattered between adult detention centers and unaccompanied migrant detention centers just based on how old they might look.
mm, wow. Well, we talked a lot about the processes and all that, but you also, talk a lot about the Moroccan society and culture and history as well. And I thought that was really fascinating that, you kind of examine the Moroccan migrant situation of having been traveled into mainland Europe after the war and things like that. And so there's this kind of, you know, dichotomy going on where Moroccans really understand this issue of transnational identity and the challenges of maintaining it and the challenges of getting into a place that promises more opportunity. Yet you sort of say that there's kind of what you call a racialization of political status, and that there's kind of this that blackness is a problem basically in attaining the same fairness that a Moroccan gets in his or her treatment. So can you talk about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. There's a alarming and rapidly rising tide of racial violence in Morocco. But because so much of my work was rooted at Europe's borders in Morocco, it was really important to me that this space or these actors not become vilified, because it's
Hmm.
easy to do that when we're
Right.
examining issues, to look at them as black and white. And it was
Hmm.
important to me to start the research by really emplacing readers in this beautiful and culturally rich country, and to introduce you to humanized versions of the key
Hmm.
actors on the ground in Morocco, to show how complicated this issue is for people in Morocco, for people in Spain, as it is for those who are fleeing their home countries across Africa. Um, yes, you touched on the fact that Morocco has a long history of immigration itself. And so oftentimes the individuals who are struggling with this rapidly expanding population of what they call sub-Saharan
Hmm.
African migrants in their country have themselves experienced marginalization
Hmm.
as an immigrant or through family members who are immigrants in Europe. Um, because there is a lot of racial diversity in Morocco, it's an interesting place to look at critical race theory and at how Blackness has become intertwined now with a migrant identity in Morocco. I was interested in looking at how that not only impacts the migrants and asylum seekers who are there, but also Moroccans who themselves would identify as Black and
Mm-hmm.
who are now increasingly being read as immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
and experiencing some of that marginalization themselves in the public sphere simply because, there's now this link between the two categories.
Yeah. Did you, I mean, obviously all this, most of the research was done before the Black Lives Matter movement and all that stuff. So do you see now kind of a new kind of link between what has been happening there on the ground and kind of this new awakening on race relations that we've been that we've been seeing around the world? And is that going to be part of what you're examining going forward?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, being there on the ground and doing the work and having, grown up in the southern US, it was
Mm-hmm.
clear to me that there were a lot of parallels. Unfortunately, I don't think that we're at that point with raising awareness, in North
Mm-hmm.
African countries that we are currently in many cities across the US. But yes, an important thing to me is showing, especially for American audiences who might feel a little disconnected from this issue. Why do I care
Mm-hmm.
what's happening in North Africa or in Southern Europe? Is by targeting, the racial inequality that exists around the world and that has been so embedded in a lot of our human rights laws, and
Mm-hmm.
showing that the issue is in fact so much larger than what's just happening here, and that there can be a lot of power in, uniting experiences and stories and activists.
Yeah, I think I just read one of the statistics, and I think it was something like, the likelihood of a Black migrant's claim being accepted is astronomically lower than those from Syria and other places. And there are multiple factors at play there as well, but it's sort of unavoidable that may be a factor. And I thought it was particularly interesting. You got into the history of um, you know Arab and Black slavery, right? This way back in the 1600s and things like, and even before. So you get really deep into this subject, and I think it's important to bring that out because you didn't just fly over that in the book. Like, you really delved into it and devoted a lot of time to it.
There's a deep history there. And, in the film, so many of the subjects, as they're talking about their experiences of migration, they really can't narrate their contemporary experiences without talking about the legacy of colonialism,
Mhm.
without talking about the impact that that has had on their country, on their community, and might continue to have by foreign ownership of resources in their country. And the fact that they're often traveling the exact same routes that were traveled in reverse, in their parents'
Mhm.
lifetime, in
Mhm.
order to access, education or work or safety.
Mhm.
But yes, for those who aren't aware, there is a, dramatically lower number of asylum seekers who are accepted, that are coming from anywhere across the African continent. The acceptance rate in the past year was about 8%, which means 92% of those
Mhm.
who were claiming asylum from across the African continent, they were not accepted.
Wow. Well, we've got a clip of the movie, and I do want to share that in a moment. I wanted to ask you one more thing before we do that, and we'll share the video clip. I think it's about 5 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. But I personally, I just want to know more about your own experience. I know you want to center the stories of those that you're focused on, and I understand that impulse as a journalist for sure. I don't like to talk about myself or share pictures and whatnot, but um, just tell us a little bit about what it was like for you, being an American white woman going into these situations and trying to tell these stories. I mean, I found the examination of your own identity and the privileges that came with that to be very interesting in the book. So I want to know if you might share some insight about that.
Yeah, it's something I always tell my students when we're picking up a new book to read in class, that before you open it, think about who wrote it, right? Whose
Mm-hmm.
perspective are you reading? How does their positionality in the space where they're conducting research filter the information that you're going to receive? And certainly true for filmmaking as well. So I think it's important to be upfront about my status as an outsider, really in every possible way,
Mm-hmm.
in the spaces that I was working in where, it's a majority youth male population of migrants and asylum seekers who are fleeing West and Central Africa. And how that positionality, I think, really made possible this particular research project that I've been able to complete. I talk a little bit about how, the enormous privilege that I carried into the space, even my ability to enter the space, to travel
Mm-hmm.
freely, based on being both an American and white, made it possible for me to get the upper level clearances that were needed. But you not only need, governmental clearances in order to access these spaces, you need the smuggling rings,
Mm.
and the brotherhoods, as they call themselves, to accept your presence there. And I think the vulnerability that I presented with as a young woman in some ways made it easier for me to gain trust
Mm-hmm.
and to, establish friendships, which ultimately is what's needed to do a project like this, for someone to allow you to journey with them and their family through really difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to be transparent about that, in the film and in the book, and it certainly shaped the text and will shape the film.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned how this was sort of, layered across various aspects of your identity too, and that, sometimes men who would not normally let a woman just sit at their table and talk with them would let you because you were not a Moroccan woman, and you were a foreigner, right? So there's so many interesting things that brings up, and I do think, I know from my own experience being a reporter coming from the outside, sometimes that gives you a view that people on the ground don't have, and it is a privilege, and you have to really kind of take care to, one, be transparent about it, but also, just to ensure that you handle it well, for sure. So
Yeah, I knew coming into the, I was working often in spaces where foreign media is not allowed, and so
mm-hmm.
the majority of the filming was actually done undercover. Um, and I knew going into it that it would be difficult, having already spent a lot of time, in the region doing research. But I don't think I knew quite how difficult it would be,
Mm-hmm.
or how many obstacles we would run into, over the course of filming. And the ability to complete the project was entirely because of the dedication of these incredible individuals who were, committed to
Yeah.
sharing this story with you all. They wanted you
Mm-hmm.
all to see their journeys.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, I'm gonna try to share my screen here and
Okay.
turn on the video. And again, this is exclusive. We're not going to be able to put this in the YouTube video, so I'm glad that the folks who are on the call will be able to see this. And we'll come back. If y'all have a question while the video is going, it would be a good time to type your question into the chat box. I know we have some comments that people wanted to make as well, particularly the Japanese ambassador wanted to mention something. So you'll have a few minutes. Do pay attention to the video, but if you want to type in a question, please do. And we'll come straight back to that, and we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes to handle those. So we did have some chats and questions that came in, some that I will try to phrase as a question, even if they were statements. One came in from the ambassador of Japan to Morocco. He said it's a complex situation. There are sub-Saharan people who want to stay in Morocco, those who want to go to Europe through Morocco, and Moroccans also wishing to go to Europe. So, sub-Saharans are treated in a humane way. The IOM is doing a great job with ministries of health and home affairs. There's a tradition of tolerance and diversity in this country for people who speak French, and for the Christians, life should not be too harsh if they are economically okay. Civil society and NGOs are also helping. The government is aware that European countries expect it to play a pivotal role in the migration issue in dealing with Spain, France, and Italy. And so on and on. People can read in the chat. But basically, I wanted to ask you, do you think that's a fair assessment? You do talk in the book, I should say, about the great work all the NGOs are doing. Particularly, and most of them, you say that most of them that are doing this great work are from Europe as well. It's not that, there's just this complete lack of empathy on the part of Europeans, right? Like most of those who are doing the work with the migrants you mentioned are from there. So do you agree with that assessment, or do you take issue with that? I think we're all.
Yeah, so the UNHCR has a significant presence, on the ground in Morocco, as does IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which is another, offshoot of the UN. as well as you mentioned, this really robust NGO sector, many of which are European, and some Moroccan, that are on the ground. And there are certainly individuals that are able to access various social services, whether it be critical healthcare or legal services through some of these organizations that are on the ground. I think the claim that we have this diversity of individuals, many of whom are seeking different outcomes, Moroccans wanting to go to Europe, Moroccans wanting to stay at home, Africans wanting to go to Europe, Africans wanting to stay in Morocco and to build a life there. Certainly we have a landscape that includes all of these various actors with various goals, some of them changing over the course of the migration. So some people might have left originally with the intention of reaching Europe, and realized maybe after multiple failed attempts that wasn't possible, and that the best possible scenario was instead to try to rebuild a life in Morocco. Yes, I have encountered individuals from all of those backgrounds. There is also a large population of migrants and asylum seekers from various African countries in Morocco who do not feel safe there, because of this growing tide of racism, and who do not feel that there is a path to a sustainable life there, just because of the difficulty of accessing, education or work. Maybe those who are not familiar, or for various reasons not able to get in touch with the NGOs that are in some of the larger cities that might be providing outreach. Having spent a lot of time, the majority of my time there, embedded in these forest camps that are around Ceuta and Melilla, as well as several that exist at the Algerian border with Morocco, where there's a lot of crossing back and forth in the camps there. Those are really desperate places, and there's definitely a need for outreach that extends beyond the hubs in Rabat and Casablanca, and reaches out to some of these centers where we have large populations of migrants and asylum seekers who are unable to access clean water and food.
Sorry, you do mention that sometimes repatriation means being sent out to the Sahara Desert, right? That's this is a real thing too, and people are not necessarily always being treated perfectly, even if sometimes in these hub centers that there are instances in which they are. So
certainly, and in the film you see some, I won't give it away, but you see some really tragic ends for some of the subjects at the hands of both Spanish and Moroccan guards who are operating in the detention centers and at the border controls around Ceuta and Melilla.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we'll save that for the film when it's released. Certainly you can get a taste of it by reading the book for sure, and we'll send people a link to the book where they can purchase it. But wanted to ask too, the Greek consul here, Consul Demopoulos, mentions that there's an essential difference between migrants and refugees, and that there's also a big issue with migrant trafficking networks. And I guess posed as a question would be like, how do we make that distinction? How do the enforcement agencies differentiate between those two things? Is that something that only can come after the claims are mounted?
So, we can make the distinction by determining who feels unsafe, or can establish a claim that they're unsafe to return to their home countries, versus those who are trying to seek greater opportunities but aren't unsafe in their home country, right? Yes, it's left to the organizations, if those individuals are able to make it far enough to assert their claim. But some of this could be combated by information campaigns on the ground, right? A greater awareness of, as you said, what the migration route entails, the dangers of traveling with smuggling rings, as he mentions, or of traveling on your own along these migratory routes, as well as really what the chances are of making it, and if you're fleeing for the right reasons. So yes, there is a legal distinction between those two categories, and there could be better awareness, I think, in sending communities about what those distinctions are and what the path towards asylum looks like, even if you make it.
Yeah, that actually leads into a question from Nuru Akinyemi. He mentions what is the responsibility of the home countries of the migrants in discouraging their citizens from leaving in the first place, especially those not fleeing conflict? So you kind of just mentioned that, but are there any other pointers that you elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, the IOM, which is obviously not the home country, this is an international organization, is doing a lot to try to raise awareness in communities about about what the risks are and what alternative paths to a sustainable future might look like at home or in surrounding countries. It would be great if sending countries all across West and Central Africa stepped up and better informed people about how these laws work, but I don't foresee that happening in the immediate future. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also a complication of factors, and it's very rarely so clean or discrete for anyone who's making the decision to leave home that it's just one thing. We see that occasionally, but in my experience, it's not often something that we see on the ground. And one of the characters who you were introduced to in the trailer, her name's Kia. She's the woman who's traveling with her husband, who she loses, and her two young children, and they're fleeing Mali. In her community in Mali, they're fleeing both a crippling poverty, the kind of poverty where people are dying from starvation in the community, and also encroaching jihadist groups and violent conflict at home. So it's a complication of these two factors. And she has a great line where, she looks at the camera and says, "What's the difference to me if my son starves to death or is killed, in battle? You lose your son, right? It doesn't matter to me which of these factors lead to the loss of my child. I don't feel safe at home, and I don't feel like this is a safe place for my children."
Mhm. You bring up jihadist groups. I mean, how do authorities? I mean, someone has brought up, and we have the same argument being made in the U.S., by the way, that jihadist groups are using the crossing in Mexico to infiltrate the U.S. But I'm sure in Europe, which is more in the brunt of most of the attacks on Western targets and from ISIS and other groups, how do you combat against that? If people are coming without documents, and you're basically having to make a decision based on a story that they're telling you.
Oh, you mean
Yeah, the idea that
asylum claims by terrorists?
yeah. So what if someone was using these smuggling routes or border, jumping on these boats along with legitimate asylum seekers and making those crossings in an attempt to infiltrate Europe? Do you think that's a problem?
I mean, I know that's a common claim, in media, and one that's used to drive up fear in receiving communities. It's not something I've ever witnessed. No. No, it's there are along the migratory route, some of the primary routes that are leading from Mali and from Nigeria, traveling up through Niger and Algeria. Violence against migrants and asylum seekers by jihadist groups that are present along those routes is a serious problem.
Mhm.
And they have an established presence along the primary migratory routes, and they're preying on individuals who are fleeing home, and so that's a real issue that individuals are up against when they leave home, and I think that they're often not aware that they're going to face on
Mhm.
that journey, but it's becoming increasingly a problem there.
Hmm. Well, we've got one more minute, and so I wanted to end on a somewhat positive note. Liz, Liz says, "This is incredible work. Do you have any recommendations for others doing things that are similar?" She's working on capturing stories across the U.S. and South America for her master's, and would love any insight and guidance. And obviously, yours is extremely deep, and so I can only imagine that there are other spots around the world where this kind of light could be shined, right?
There are, yeah, of course. And there's incredible work being done at critical border crossings all around the world. On the I don't know if we can send a link to participants afterwards. So Oxford University Press has created a site for the book, which allows you to access, further resources. And I've put together a whole list of other documentary films and books and articles that have been written from different perspectives and at different points in history and around the world. It's a great place to look if you want to dig into, perhaps what's happening at the US-Mexico border or what was happening in this space 50 years ago. So I encourage people to check that out.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. And yes, we certainly will send that out, and we will encourage people to get a copy. I'm into it and really enjoying it, and really appreciate your time. we'll send it not only to the people who've shown up on the call, but we had others who registered that weren't able to make it. But again, appreciate you, and hopefully we'll get to see you in Atlanta again.
Yes, thank you to everyone for joining. I appreciate your time.
Let us know when you're in town. Talk to you soon.
Will do. Thanks, Trevor.
Bye.
Bye.